Hi. This video is the third in a series intended to introduce people to the philosophy of existentialism. In this one, I'd like to situate existentialism within the larger arc of Western history. The central question I'll be exploring is, what was going on in the world that helped give rise to a movement like existentialism? What historical and cultural realities was existentialism responding to, and why? I feel that it's important to examine existential thought in this way if we really want to understand its relevance not only historically, but for our world today. Then, in the next video in this series, I'll narrow the focus quite a bit by exploring the tension between two philosophers, Soren Kierkegaard and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, which was crucial to existentialism's birth in the mid-19th century. Then, I'll situate some of existentialism's principal thinkers, texts, and ideas along its historical timeline. And finally, I'll explore existentialism's endpoint in terms of the rise of structuralism within continental thought. But let's get back to this video. I'd like to organize this video in terms of three rough and approximate historical periods. A pre-existential period, which ran from classical antiquity to the early mid-19th century. Then, the period of existentialism's rise and eventual apogee, which lasted into the latter half of the 20th century. And finally, a post-existential period, which began in the later mid-20th century and extends to the present. So, let's look at the pre-existential period first. What we're looking for here are thinkers who are not existentialists properly speaking, but antecedents or precursors to existentialism. People whose thought seemed to embody some fraction of existentialism's ideas or animating spirit. Of course, how one evaluates various thinkers in that regard is probably unavoidably somewhat arbitrary. So I'll mention some that I personally regard as important precursors to existentialism. As I said in the previous video in this series, first among these would probably be the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Heraclitus, whom existentialists usually regard with considerable admiration. That's because Heraclitus's writings, which today we possess only in the form of fragments of the original texts, place frequent emphasis on the priority of metamorphosis and transcendence in life. Basically, the processes of change. So, from Heraclitus, we get some maxims that have endured into our own age, such as, you can't step into the same river twice, and war is the father of all things, which almost sound like epigrams from one of Nietzsche's books. However, I would also say that another important antecedent occurs in the Bible, and more specifically in the book of Ecclesiastes. In Ecclesiastes, we're presented with a figure who goes through many significant changes in his life. At one point, he quests after wealth and position, but discovers that all of that is really just a form of vanity. At another point, he seeks after learning and knowledge, but discovers that that too is ultimately about vanity. Eventually, he declares, "Vanity, vanity, all is vanity and a chasing after wind." Much like existentialism, Ecclesiastes underscores the unsettling futility and triviality of our usual conventional projects and ways of relating to the world, and issues a call to see our lives in much deeper, much more encompassing ways. And perhaps the third antecedent we should mention from the period of antiquity would be Stoicism, whose most famous exponent was probably the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Much like existentialism, Stoicism is about accepting the present moment as it presents itself, and about not allowing ourselves to be controlled by our desire for pleasure or our fear of pain, as well as about using our minds to understand the world around us and to do our part in nature's plan. And finally, I'd like to mention two Enlightenment Era thinkers among existentialism's precursors, the English poet William Blake and the French philosopher, mathematician, and physicist Blaise Pascal. Blake, for seeking a larger integration of the darker, more unsettling side of human nature, as in his Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and Pascal, for various fragments that appear in his work Pensies, such as the heart has its own reasons that reason knows not of. And reason's last step is the recognition that there are an infinite number of things which are beyond it. And to make light of philosophy is to be a true philosopher. However, as I said earlier, although we can locate antecedents to existentialism within the larger arc of Western history, existentialism proper really began in the 19th century. However, like every major philosophical movement, existentialism was also a reflection of and response to its larger cultural context. So, to understand how existentialism emerged and flourished for over a century, we should probably begin by recognizing the kind of world that gave birth to it. Basically, existentialism thrived during the Western industrial era and then waned in the later 20th century as the industrial age gave way to today's technological period. So, one way of understanding why existentialism was so influential for over a century would be to inquire into what it was responding to in the industrial period. I would say that one of the most significant elements of the industrial world had to do with a kind of depersonalization, with the loss of the sense of significance of being a unique and distinct human being. For instance, one can see this in the movement away from individual apprenticeship and craftsmanship and toward mechanized production. For example, just imagine what it felt like to be a farmer or journeyman craftsman who felt forced to move to the city to turn the exact same bolt in the exact same way on an assembly line for 10 hours per day, every day. Imagine how much of his unique humanity would be drained away as weeks of doing that turned into months, and months into years, and years into a lifetime. A depersonalizing industrial reality that Karl Marx was to take up in a different way with his emphasis on homo faber and the alienation of labor. And of course, along with the rising tide of mechanized production came a correlative flood of modern bureaucracy, with its all too familiar anonymity and callousness. And as many decades of this passed, and as the world became increasingly depersonalized along these dimensions, it provided fertile ground for the birth of a countervailing narrative and worldview, one that would attempt, among other things, to rebalance the scales by stressing the primacy of individual freedom and responsibility, as well as the importance of fulfilling our unique possibilities in life, and ultimately creating a powerful destiny out of our lives, both individually and collectively. However, along with the dynamics of depersonalization that attended the advent of mechanized production and bureaucracy, the industrial age ushered in a new kind of ethic for our lives, one that promoted the kind of practical rationality that would help us be better adapted to the demands of an automated age. But of course, along with that came a compartmentalization and demotion of the emotions and passions, which only seemed to complicate the efficiency of industrial production. The able denizen of the industrial age was cool, rational, and practical, someone who was rarely, if ever, overcome by his emotions. As a general indicator of all of this, one need only remember how sexually repressive the Victorian and Edwardian eras were, which incidentally also gave impetus to Freud's psychoanalytic insights with their heavy emphasis on, yeah, you guessed it, the dynamics of people's repressed libidinal energies. The point is that once again, the industrial age provided very fertile ground for a movement like existentialism, which would seek to balance the practical, rational side of life with the equally important, passionate side of life. However, in addition to the industrial age's tendency toward depersonalization and an overemphasis on practical reason, a third factor we should probably mention would be the ongoing diminution of religion's influence in the Western world. Of course, this was already stirring during the Enlightenment period, when empirical scientific inquiry began to challenge the traditional Christian view of life, the universe, and everything. Basically, Galileo's dilemma. But it really intensified during the industrial age. Of course, there were still churches and believers during that period, much as there are today. But the thing that increasingly slipped away, which was so glaringly obvious during the medieval period, was the whole centrality of the Christian God as the singular central organizing principle that encompassed, organized, and suffused everything in the entire Western world. Basically, during the industrial period, God and religious life no longer organized and made sense of everything in life because other forces had begun to take precedence in our prevailing cultural practices. In other words, God began to occupy a relatively small, fractional position in our cultural affairs, something more like a hobby than the be-all end-all answer to all of our burning questions. However, it turned out that this was a double-edged sword. On one hand, this movement gave free rein to scientific inquiry and the industry that derived from it to introduce new, unprecedented boons and benefits into our world. But on the other hand, it eroded the central narrative that had made sense of life for many centuries and for practically the entire Western world. And this left our world in an increasing state of what Viktor Frankl calls existential vacuum. A world shorn of a powerful and compelling set of meanings that would make sense of our lives and provide a locus of social cohesion and help us orient ourselves meaningfully to reality. Of course, in place of God and religious life, the industrial and technological ages did offer up a narrative of sorts. Basically, it was about progress, about things getting bigger and better all the time. But the problem with that was, and is, that it provides precious little sense of transcendence, little sense that there's a deep and satisfying destiny for the human race. Something like redemption or being at the right hand of God. Yes, things may be getting bigger and better in modernity, but to what end? What's the deep point of it all? The poet William Butler Yeats famously, and somewhat ironically, captured the disorienting quality of this kind of existential vacuum pretty well in 1919. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. And from the depth of this disorienting and disquieting chasm, this fault line in the topography of the modern world was born, existentialism. But perhaps more than any other singular phenomenon, the thing that really galvanized existentialism, especially in the 20th century, was the changing nature of war. War as an industrial phenomenon, complete with new ways to kill and die, with death counts in the tens of millions and all the horrors of automated genocide, culminating ultimately in the apocalyptic spectacle of nuclear obliteration and the ensuing hypervigilance and paranoia of the Cold War. And with all of this, it became all too obvious that the wonderful boons of modernity were riding right alongside its horrific banes, and it was necessary for someone to address it, to explore the river of humanity's newfound heart of darkness, as it were. However, as the Cold War dissolved with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the industrial period began to give way to a technological era, so too did the nature and direction of continental philosophy change. Existentialism began to give way first to structuralism and then to the triumvirate of post-structuralism, deconstructionism, and postmodernism. But like I said earlier, I'll save the detailed story of existentialism's denouement for the next video in this series, along with exploring the tension between Hegel and Kierkegaard at the point of existentialism's origin, as well as locating some of existentialism's principal thinkers and texts along the timeline of its overall trajectory. Until then, enjoy the day. Peace out.